So I hope that you're all doing well. I'm sorry that I'm not able to be there with you guys today, but thank you for giving me some time to share my paper with you. A couple of things. I'm just going to look kind of this way because that's where my paper is kind of set up. And second, I'm probably not going to edit this video through because I'm not talented like that. So please give me some grace, but I think it should be fine. So I did my paper on Sati, which is the widow immolation in India. Oh, I also have to talk like this close into my laptop, otherwise you really can't hear me. I hope that's okay. But I did my paper on Sati, and Sati is basically widow burning in India. And it was a tradition that started way back up. The first track that we have is actually 300 AD. And it was when there was an Indian soldier who was fighting actually in one of the wars curated by Alexander the Great, and he died, and his two widows wanted to commit sati over the general's dead body. So that was our first kind of historical proof that we have of sati. And also Sati is basically, it originates from a Puranic Hindu story where the goddess Sati, also the wife of Shiva, commits suicide on the death here of her husband Shiva. But what happens is Shiva can't actually die because Shiva is immortal. And so Sati's sacrifice is seen as this big giving of herself for the sake of her husband, and in a way that she kind of is a worthy partner in this world and the next, that her traits, that her sacrifice are things that are beautiful in her sacrifice that then carry on into the life after. And so that's kind of the cultural narrative that surrounds Sati. It's that the idea that if a widow begins to immolate herself or commit suicide on the death of her husband, if as he's being cremated, if she burns herself alive alongside of him, is kind of the cultural narrative is that she's a woman of great sacrifice, great love, and it's her kind of wife duty to begin to walk alongside her husband in the afterlife. And so it's, as you can understand, very horrific practice, a woman to be burnt alive. But there's this great cultural narrative behind it to kind of like glorify it. And in my research, I found a lot actually, but what I want to kind of highlight to you guys is maybe the idea that the story isn't what it always seems. That even though there's this great cultural narrative in which the woman is seen as this big sacrifice and just, you know, a sign of utmost expression of love, that really there's a good economic profit and social kind of liberation that happens when a woman commits sati. And this is really sad, but basically in patriarchal Indian culture, there's not a lot of room in society for the woman. And her main role is to operate as a wife. So if she's not there anymore to operate as a wife, she really doesn't have any logical reason to exist. And so the life of a widow, even if she chooses not to commit sati, isn't anything desirable. Typically a woman wears all white to signify mourning. In some places of India, they shave her head as kind of a sign of shame. She's expected to live an ascetic life, like ascetic, as like the life of the monks, and a celibate life. And in some places, the widow is actually forced to downgrade her sense of luxury, which, as you can already hear, doesn't have any luxury behind it. A woman is sometimes forced to go down to even one meal a day. She's socially ostracized. Some may constrict her to the home. And it's just, the life of a widow is just not desirable. It is not desirable. And in this sense, there is a great prejudice against the widow's life. is not seen as something worth keeping or protecting. And therefore, it kind of begins, the practice of sati begins to look more sinister when we see this misogynistic underpinning behind it. Now, when a woman becomes a widow, she has three options. She can commit sati, or she could choose to live this ascetic lifestyle either in her own home, or the home of her parents, or in the home of her in-laws. Now, this begins to reveal some problems, because if the widow decides to go home, she takes her dowry with her, and Indian dowries can be very generous. So there's that. She goes home with her dowry, or she could choose to remain and live this aesthetic. I'm gonna stop using that word. Or she could choose to use that, live that life with her in-laws. But as you can see, like, the in-laws don't necessarily want her around. She's kind of a burden, and the in-laws don't want to send her back home because then they lose her dowry. And so, in a lot of ways, a lot of women end up committing sati because of social pressure, that the in-laws convince her to commit sati. And there have been many cases where the woman loses courage in the last second to commit sati, and she's thrown into the fire by the priest or the in-laws or her parents or whatever. And it's really horrific. And in another sense too, there's a lot of cultural pressure to commit sati, because as you guys can hear, the life of a widow is not worth it. Actually, in some places, I forgot to mention this, but in some places, they even stop referring to the woman as she and refer to her as it. And that's a life that some don't want. And so they end up committing sati because at least in this act of sacrifice, they can be deified, glorified as great wives who give their lives up, rather than being social outcasts. So the system is set up for, in this way, this misogynistic system to commit sati as this like economic profit and liberation from the widow. And it's really horrible. But what happens though in Indian history is that when the British come to India, they have a real interest in sati because they hate it. Obviously, it's very violent, it's oppressive to women. And so Christian missionaries, really interesting, Charles Grant, William Wilberforce, William Carey, and David Brown, just to name a few, are so horrified by the practice that they make it their individual duty to rid India of it. And so what happens is, because the British were first mercantile, they were part of in India to do business. And so the companies that were in India begin to keep surveillance of how much sati is happening in India. But here's the thing, they start counting only where the British are already located. So let's say, for example, that each missionary is in charge at approximately 800 kilometer square feet of land. And so they'll collect data from there. And then they will, as you're collecting data, they presume that wherever the missionaries aren't, that area naturally has more crimes of sati. So William Ward claimed that 5,000 windows were burnt in Calcutta, but in his publication he just doubles this figure, presuming that 2 widows were burnt alive in each village outside of Calcutta. So he just presumes 10,000. And so these kinds of like over-exaggerated numbers are exchanged by the missionaries, and the numbers just keep getting more and more elevated. Charles Grant claimed 33,000 were killed in India every year. And so there's this like great push to get sati revoked, but as a means there's a big prejudice to presume that sati is a lot more prevalent than it actually is. Sati is wrong, it is violent, it is dangerous, but it is exaggerated to make it seem like this huge epidemic within India when it indeed is not. And so a lot of the surveys have very exaggerated numbers. This is a problem because this creates a big hype in Britain, and there's a big propaganda to carry the mission movement into India and save these women from these men, and it basically functions to justify British rule in India. And it basically Sati, the abolition of Sati begins to cement and legitimize the British presence in India. And so the British end up outlawing Sati in 1892 or 1829, sorry. But there's no social resistance because really Sati wasn't that prevalent anyways. So there's no social resistance. But now India is going to be colonized by the British. And so what I focus the main part of my essay on is Sati as a multi-layered oppression. You hear already, right, the complex ways in which Sati is oppressive to women by Indian natives, and then how Sati was used, the abolition of Sati was used to oppress the Indian people. But the problem is in this whole conversation of Sati, the female voice is still missing. Gayatri Spivak, in her article, Can the Subaltern Speak?, talks about this. She says that in this whole conversation, what ends up happening is the British start arguing and saying, you shouldn't commit Sati. And all the Indian natives end up saying is, oh, well, she wanted to commit Sati. It was voluntary. Rather than ever actually hearing the voice of the subaltern, the voice of the marginalized woman, of what is actually happening, how are you actually dealing with this? And Spivak says that what ends up happening is the subaltern, the woman's voice gets lost because the British end up saving the brown woman from because the scenario becomes white men saving the brown woman from brown men. And it never actually allows a woman to reclaim her voice. And it's so interesting because we see this outplay 100 years later. So 100 years later, there's a case study. Ruth Gunwar is a young bride in India. She's 18 years old and she commits Sati. And there's a big national outcry all over India about why this happened, why Ruth committed Sati. Was it her? Was she forced by her parents? Blah, blah, blah. And there was a feminist response to this that was very aggravated by the conversation. And basically, the feminists at the time were arguing, why are we trying to understand if Ruth Gunwar's Sati was legitimate or not? Sati is outlawed. It's illegal. If it really was a communal act, a ritual, which it often is, then it's murder. Why are we having this conversation? And so this is the first time that a woman's voice is included in the conversation of Sati. So this is 1982, is a woman's voice is caught up in the conversation of Sati. But these women aren't understood as Indian voices critiquing an Indian infrastructure. These women, these Indian feminists who talked against Sati were deemed to be Western voices, not Indian voices. And so that's a problem. And in my paper, I argue that this stems back at the fact that when Sati was abolished, even though it was great that Sati was abolished, it failed to reclaim the feminine voice, the female voice in the conversation. That the woman, the subaltern, was still not allowed to speak for herself. And so now, when she does speak for herself, 100 years later, she's still understood to be a voice of the Westerner, rather than the voice of an Indian woman oppressed, speaking out against oppression in her system. And so I basically finished my paper trying to talk about how we can learn, we can't change the past, but how can we learn to support the subaltern voice in a way that when they are communicating, they're beings that are communicating and talking back to the system, but validated for their own voice. And this part wasn't in my paper, but I'm just going to add it because I also found it was really interesting, is that my main intent of this paper was to kind of prove that Sikh theology was more liberative for women than Christian theology. But it was really horrifying for me because in my research, even though Sikhism was a big feminist movement within India, in my research I found that many prominent Sikh figures, for example, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who was a king of India, king of Punjab, a Sikh king, his 7 wives were forced to commit Sati. And I began to realize that our cultures as it's so easy to try to think, or at least for me, that this culture is so much better and this culture is so much better, these ideas are better, and some of them are. But our oppressions and our sins against one another are so trickled down into the social structure that in whichever social regime our conversations begin in, those regimes can still be oppressive. So Sikhism, yes, great feminist movement, but also absorbed in itself these great crimes against women. And so I feel like a response to this is in some ways to put down a hierarchical view of these philosophies are better and these philosophies are better, and begin to embrace the reality of what oppression is for people, which is just a systematic approach that begins to absorb itself into cultures. And unless we take time to recognize who is a subaltern voice and what are they saying, we can, even in our attempt of liberation, like the British, forget to validate the voice of the oppressed and the marginalized. And so that is my paper. I really hope you can hear me well. I did my best with the sound. I didn't edit it, but I got 16 minutes, so I'm in time. And I wish you guys well, and hopefully I'll see you guys soon. Oh, there we go.